Welcome everybody to this session of the Being Human Festival. This is the first session of today, and it's History in the Making 2020 for the Future. Really should be a fantastic session. Thank you all for coming. If you plan on tweeting about this session, the hashtag is HistDay20. It's in the slide that was at the beginning. We've got a great lineup of speakers. The plan today is that we all give approximately 5 minutes of chat about what we do in our places, and then it's going to be an open panel session. And this is where you get an opportunity to ask some questions. If you do have a question, put a Q or question and then write it into the chat, and we'll try and keep an eye on those and bring them in where possible. So without any further ado, I'd just like to quickly introduce all of our panel, and then each one of them will give a little short talk about what they do. My name is Jason Webber. I am the Web Archiving Engagement Manager for the UK Web Archive. I'm usually based at the British Library in St Pancras, and now I'm based in South East London most of the time. We also have Dr. Fiona Courage, Curator of Mass Observation at the University of Sussex. We've got Rhoda Boateng, the Black Cultural Archives, Julia Alcamo, I apologise, documentary filmmaker and co-founder of Happenstance Films, Brendan Cormier of V&A, and Will Massa, Curator of Contemporary Film Fiction at the BFI. What a lineup. So first of all, can I ask Fiona, if you could tell us a little bit about what you've been doing collecting in 2020.
Indeed. Right, I'm just going to share my screen and hope it's the right screen. Otherwise, right, hopefully that is the right screen. If somebody could nod, Jason, could you nod if you can see that as a brilliant, thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for asking me to participate in this. It's quite hard because I normally talk about mass observation for hours and hours, so to try and talk about it in 5 minutes is problematic. But if you do want any further information on mass observation or on the COVID work that we've been doing or any other work, then please do have a look at the mass observation website, which if you just Google, it'll come up. As a good librarian, I shouldn't say that, but that's what I'll say, use Google. So what is mass observation? Well, it was founded in 1937 as an independent social survey organisation, and the idea was to use anthropological fieldwork and ethnographic observation techniques to get people in the UK to observe their own lives and the lives around them. And the idea was very much about gathering that information and then making it available back out to the general public. And the way that the founders described the people that were participating were as cameras of everyday life, so taking snapshots of their lives. And another lovely description was that they're the meteorological weather stations of opinion and experience in Britain at that particular point. Now, of course, it started in 1937, which meant it was just before the Second World War. And it continued throughout the Second World War. And the reason I want to talk a little bit about this is because, in a sense, that's when it started to gather rapid response, that idea of the outcome of battles or political changes or what have you. Immediately, people were writing about this and sending it into mass observation. And what was really wonderful is that it covered both the macro of life, you know, the big things that were happening in the world during that period, right down to the micro. So what people were having for their dinner, what effect the war was having on their mood, what they were dreaming about, all sorts of things like that. And I say this as an example of the fact that actually, when something like COVID appears for mass observation, we just go, oh, it's really awful for the world, but actually this is an amazing opportunity for us to start gathering again. Now, we have been gathering, so since 1937, apart from a few years in the 1960s and 1970s where the organisation went into abeyance, we've been gathering data on everyday life in Britain. And since 1981, we've been based at the University of Sussex. techniques, and we have a panel of volunteer writers who respond to questionnaires that we send out to them 3 times a year. And those questionnaires can be on, you know, anything from what's on your mantelpiece through to what did you dream last night, what do you think of the general election. But within that, we've also responded to events. So, for example, the death of Diana in 1997, without even asking people to write to us about the responses to our volunteers were writing in. They were writing in about their opinions of it. They were writing in about their emotions relating to it. Things such as the BSE crisis, for those of you as old as me and remember sort of a mad cow disease, people started writing in about how that affected the way they ate, the way that they lived. So, of course, when something like COVID happens, it's similar in that people will start writing about it. But unlike something like the death of Princess Diana, and more like something like the Second World War, this suddenly becomes a global experience. This is something that many, many people, you know, the entire world is experiencing. And I know that other speakers today will talk about that as well. So as a result, we use the same techniques we would normally do. We asked our volunteer panel to write about their experiences and their thoughts and their fears relating to COVID. But we also put out our annual May the 12th call, which every May the 12th, we ask people to keep a day diary. And this year we put that out as usual. And normally, you know, we get 200 or 300 responses in that. And this year we got 5,000. We were absolutely bowled over. When we get 5,000 responses. And we started to read those responses and start to understand the globalness of COVID and how that kind of was affecting people. But also we started to think about why is this different? Why is this different in terms of our responses? And of course it relates to time. People had more time on their hands. They were looking for ways to fill that time, and they therefore were able to respond to calls out for their thoughts and opinions and experiences. But also I think it was part of that sense of being a part of a global event. You know, wanting to mark your place in history, wanting to have your voice heard amongst the millions and the billions of voices that are out there. And for others, it was a therapeutic tool. And writing, as we know, for many of us has always been a therapeutic tool. And what I've got is some examples on the screen here of some of just, you know, samples of the responses that we got through. Often they were just sort of typewritten, but we also had diaries. We have there, one particular person drew or sketched a different thing for an alphabet for the first 26 days of the COVID lockdown, and we have bulletins there for B. Others kept diaries. They wrote about, you know, that minutiae. And I just want to finish by taking a quote from a colleague of mine, Professor Claire Langhammer, from a talk that she actually gave to IHR, which I believe is on the website. There's a recording for it from the summer, in which she says that the material collected by mass observation in this period raises lots of questions, but including how we weigh the macro and the micro sources, about how the individual, community, the local and the national intersect, and about the role of transnational ideas and transnational feelings in framing global responses. And I'm going to leave it there because I think I'll probably run out of my 5 minutes, but that's something to think about. Thank you.
Thanks, Fiona. That was really amazing. I've long admired the work of the mass observation. It's really, really good. Can I now invite Rhoda to tell us a little bit about the work at Black Cultural Archives?
Hi, thanks Jason, and thanks Fiona. That was really illuminating. I'm just going to share my screen now. So yeah, I'm Rhoda. I'm the archive supervisor at Black Cultural Archives, and I'm going to talk about our digital collecting call out called Document, which was collecting around this year's Black Lives Matter protests. But I thought I'd just start by giving a bit of background to BCA as an organisation. And BCA started as an organisation in 1981 as a response to various events, including the New Cross Massacre and uprisings of 1981 and the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. So it's an organisation that was really born out of civil unrest and out of, you know, making something in response to that was positive for members of the community. So our founders kind of came to the conclusion that what was needed was a space where people of African and Caribbean descent in the UK could find positive representations of themselves in history and culture. So this act of self-help expanded into the creation of what our founders called an archive museum, that would paint a more comprehensive picture of the Black presence in the UK. So for us, the value of archiving is really rooted in this mission, to collect and preserve and celebrate the histories of people of African and Caribbean descent in the UK. And I think this quote by our co-founder, Len Garrison, sums it up better than I could, which is, somebody has to go out and collect it and rescue it, retrieve it, preserve it and protect it. So I think it kind of encapsulates the active process that BCA kind of always has when it comes to amassing more material. So when the Black Lives Matter protests kind of erupted around the world as a response to the murdering of George Floyd, and also picked up traction in the UK, BCA as an organisation kind of felt that we were really well placed to collect around these protests and to collect the responses. So as a result, we launched Document Collecting Black Lives Matter. And it was our first kind of rapid response collecting project. And generally the project was a lot of firsts for BCA in terms of actively seeking out digital material. But we felt it was really important to capture this material, especially because we feel like BCA is a place where these kind of moments, if you could call them that, become like contextualized into like a more far-reaching project, especially as it relates to anti-racist work in the UK, and those histories often get ignored in different ways. So it's also, in a way, thinking about what was going on organisationally at the time. Obviously, we're in the midst of the pandemic, and we'd kind of spoken a lot about collecting around COVID-19, but we found that really difficult for many reasons. There are lots of ethical considerations about health collecting, and as an organisation, we were also very much personally impacted by COVID. So we didn't manage to do a call out for COVID, but by the time that these protests were taking off, we really felt a responsibility to collect. So we were asking people to send what they could, so photographs, videos, artworks, or to kind of create this archive that isn't, you know, a comprehensive Black Lives Matter archive, but goes like some way towards collecting around those protests. So I'm just going to end by showing you one example of something that we did collect, which I think is, for me, like a really potent example of what this kind of collecting can do. So it's a spreadsheet by Laemi Ikomi, and it's what she calls a living spreadsheet or an accountability spreadsheet. So she was documenting different organizations' response to the protests and different organizations' responses to this kind of call for action around racism. And she was, with the help of some others, kind of documenting what organizations were saying and making notes and kind of like following up. And I think it's really interesting because it's a project that speaks so much to this time in terms of activism kind of happening in online spaces, and also the fact that, you know, COVID meant people were really thinking about creative ways that they could participate in these protests. And I think this is like a really good example. So it kind of, it captures what a digital call out can kind of do around this sort of protesting, and also as some like food for thought, I think, for any organization. So yeah, there's like lots of things that I could say, but I imagine, is that 5 minutes? I'm probably done. But I'm sure that we'll get to speak a lot more in the panel discussion about everything. So thank you.
Thank you, Rhoda. That's amazing. I'm sure we're all, I know the British Library's response, I'm sure, is in that spreadsheet, and I really hope we're kept to account. Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for that. That's really good. And I've again admired the work of BCA for years now, so that's really good. Next, I'd like to welcome Julia to talk about her work.
Thank you. And I'm also going to do a quick screen share. Here we go. Yes, there we go. Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Julia from the digital exhibition project All We Have. We collect personal stories from the pandemic, but from around the world. So what Fiona pointed out before, a global perspective. The faces you see popping up on the screen now are those of some of our contributors. We've done 43 interviews to date, from Australia to Peru, from Pakistan to New York City. And we're still going today. The project was really born out of an urgent need to record a very unique moment in our lives. We're filmmakers, and for the first time in my life, certainly, I could pick up the phone to really anywhere in the world and ask, so how are you dealing with COVID? How are you dealing with lockdown? And as we collected these very small stories, these very intimate stories and personal stories from around the world, we realized that there were some big themes emerging that really connected us cross-continentally, cross-culturally, which we've trying to sort of make sense of. So some of them are like things like parenting and the pandemic, how we deal with self-reflection, our anxiety around age and health, our shared anger, failure of leadership. And really, it was a huge showcase of resilience. And because you're going to get to hear plenty of my beautiful voice throughout the session, I thought I'd actually share the platform with by sharing 3 interview clips with you. 3 women from 3 very different parts of the world and 3 very different walks of life. So we're going to start off by hearing 21-year-old Muntaha, who lives in Kashmir. And as some of you might know, Kashmir hasn't been in lockdown since March or even since January, but in some form of lockdown since August 2019.
The nature of lockdown feels like same, the barbed wires, the barricades, you can't go out, you can't do that. And it's like, okay, virus is not a tangible entity. You don't need these barricades or the barbed wires to control, So that's very much different, because when I look at the images from the other parts of the world, the lockdown is not like barbed wires and the barricades. But I think this lockdown has contextualized the suffering, I got so many messages, like people are like, oh, now we know your pain, now we can see you. We know how it is, how difficult it is, and how depressing it is, and how frustrating it is. And that's what I'm basically advocating for, to tell people that this is frustrating, this is depressing, and we need to, we need to talk about the stories, we need to listen to the stories people are gonna tell us, and we need to make them feel like they are equal human beings. This lockdown, this global lockdown, has contextualized the suffering of the people who are suffering from a longer time.
The second voice is Vera in Brussels. Vera has a young family and another son on the way, but her father unfortunately ended up in hospital with COVID-19 and was on a ventilator for 5 weeks.
But I felt a lot of regret for not being able to, or not calling him more in the 10 days before, for not knowing for not picking up on the fact that he was ill. I mean, I had spoken to him just 2 days before he was hospitalized to tell him I was having another little boy. And our phone call lasted maybe 1 minute. And thinking back, I thought, did I even let him speak? Did I even, I would have heard if he had difficulty breathing. But apparently it was a very difficult evening for him that day, and I didn't hear it. I didn't pick up on it. So I blame myself also for not being more involved and not picking up on it myself, and I also felt robbed of the opportunity. So it was a mixture of feelings, but it was difficult to process.
And the final voice that I want to share with you now is Suzanne, who lives in Hanoi, Vietnam. She's an American expatriate, and she reflects here in the segment really on what's going to happen during a second wave, which we're very much in now, of course.
I think that is one of the really interesting things for all of us that we're living with right now, because as some of the restrictions are being lifted, like I'm so happy now I can ride my bike around West Lake, and I see everybody exercising and ballroom dancing and meditating, and it's so wonderful. I'm back in that mode where I'm planning my life, so I'm falling right back into that pattern of, okay, and 3 months from now I'm going to go there, and then I realize you can't do that. You just can't do it now. You can't make plans. You have to just live in the moment and just accept, all right, well, that's concept that's out there. And maybe I'll do that, but maybe that just won't happen. It's so wonderful because I'm relearning all these lessons that this pandemic, I think, is teaching all of us. It's like, we don't know what's going to happen. You know, you try your best to, you know, just take care of your life as best you can and be the best that you can be, but you really don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And we don't know what's going to happen with this pandemic. I don't know, just get comfortable with not knowing. So I guess to answer your question, I don't know where I'm going to be in 2 months' time. We have to keep our sense of humor always. That's so important.
Isn't you right? So that's just a very small taster, really, of the archive that we're trying to create of 2020 from around the world. Back to you, Jason.
Get comfortable with not knowing. That sounds solid but quite difficult advice. I've got some really questions about how that works. That's really, really, really good. Thank you, Julia. That's really, really, really amazing. Next up, we're going to hear from Brendan Cormier from the V&A Museum.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. I'll do what everybody else is doing and share my screen. Right. So yes, my name is Brendan. I'm a senior curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And for the last, well, since April, I would say, I've been working on a project and leading a project at the museum called Pandemic Objects. I'll tell you more about kind of the backstory in a second, but essentially what it is, it's a blog, but I use a fancier word, I say editorial project, which focuses in each post on a generic object and tries to understand in what ways that the objects are helping us better understand the pandemic, and vice versa. The pandemic is being used as a lens to understand objects. And I'll just jump over that because that's such a kind of fiddly list of bullet points, but this is actually really where it came from. So the V&A is a museum of applied arts, a museum of design. And so at the beginning of the pandemic, there was this kind of understanding, especially from my department, which focuses on contemporary design, where we have a long-running program called Rapid Response Collecting, that we would be collecting the pandemic and collecting the design stories from the pandemic. But the problem was, and I would argue still kind of continues to be, is that actually design, capital D design, during this pandemic has really been somewhat of a letdown and somewhat of a somewhat failing in its grandiose attempt to say that design can save the world. And so one of the posts that I love the most is this zine post, where you know, a somewhat idiotic design response gets a snarky reader comment saying, "Please stop with this stupidity." Rather, what's been really interesting with the pandemic and what has been the inspiration for pandemic objects has been the inherent intelligence and usefulness of objects. And so the whole blog itself started with an observation that I had walking down the street early on in the lockdown, which was that our daily rituals had been redefined by handwritten signs, and we were our protocols were changing, and we were communicating with handwritten signs, which we never did before. And then we can expand that and look at, you know, all these different objects which have changed meeting: the sewing machine, drones as a form of escapism, Animal Crossing as a new digital layer for convening. And so really what the Pandemic Objects blog was an opportunity to extend research and writing out to the broader community of colleagues at the V&A to focus on particular objects and to explore the way that they have changed meaning, but also to use the blog space as a way of digging into our own collections and finding relationships between things we might not have considered at once to be pandemic related, but because of the all-encompassing nature of the pandemic, and because objects have become incredibly interesting and useful during this time, to make those relationships back to the collection. So that is pandemic objects, and I encourage you all to go check it out. We have about 64 pandemic objects up on the collection now. And I will stop sharing here.
Thanks so much, Brendan. That's absolutely fascinating project. I'm quite liking the difference between the scale of things we do, from quite intimate interviews through to, well, we do thousands of things. Next up, we have Will Massa, Curator of Contemporary Film Fiction at the BFI. Take it away, Will.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting us all today, Jason. I'm going to share my screen now. Here we go. Can you all see that? Excellent, great, wonderful. So yes, my name is Will Massa. I am Curator of Contemporary Fiction Film at the BFI National Archive. The BFI, amongst many other things, looks after and develops the National Film and Television Collection, which is one of the oldest and largest and richest collections of film, TV, and the moving image in the world. We hold materials all the way from the birth of cinema, and we collect into the present day and beyond. I'll explain what beyond means. But on the 28th of April this year, we launched a project called Britain on Lockdown. Online video or web film is well within the scope of the BFI's collecting policy. But the sheer volume, quantity of it, and the varying platforms on which it circulates has often provided a challenge for our curatorial team. So Britain on Lockdown really represents the first focused effort to collect web film or film from the online space, or that is created digitally and circulated digitally against a particular theme. We wanted to do several things with this project. Firstly, we noticed that online video had a sort of pivotal role in the way in which we were all experiencing the lockdown or the impact of coronavirus. I mean, online video is saturates daily life anyway, but it seemed to be providing a sort of cohesive social fabric or connective tissue, let's say during the first lockdown at any rate. And it also helps us to make the case to the public. This is the National Archive, after all, that web film, online film, although it might feel ephemeral, although it might feel disposable, it actually can be understood as part of a longer history of the moving image and is culturally super important and super worthy of preservation. The top line criteria for the works that we wanted to collect are the top line criteria against all our collecting, which are works that represent the art, history, and impact of the moving image. But web film does throw up quite a lot of considerations, and we wanted to collect against a broad variety of production types, works that represented different age groups, that represented different subject matter, that were a regional representation, that offered a diversity of perspective, that were professional or amateur. So we launched a campaign and we asked the public to recommend to us the videos that they felt best represented coronavirus and the impact of lockdown, and we combined that with some of our own internal curatorial decision making. I'm just trying to change the slide now. So that is just a sort of tip of the iceberg indication of the variety of media that's been circulating and what might fit within the remit of the project. So we've got everything from Boris Johnson describing his symptoms to Joe Wicks to the sort of anti-clap for carers video that was put out by Workers of Colour, clap for us now, how ironic, to people doing TikTok challenges, old people's homes, you name it. Dawn Shadforth, frontline worker Dawn, breaking down in her car when she couldn't get the essential goods that she needed after a 48-hour shift. The project in numbers so far is we have a combination of 1,153 films, 688 of which were suggested by the public, 465 nominated internally, and we're going through those and we are whittling them down, and we're currently at a shortlist of 287, and I think ultimately we're looking to build a canon a sort of lockdown canon of around 280, of around 100 videos. And so this is interesting for us as an organization because it is a rapid response project, and it's the first sort of project of that nature that we've undertaken. And why are we doing it? Well, we're doing it for two reasons. Firstly, for the reasons I said before about the sort of cultural relevance of online video, but secondly, this material is really precarious, and there are a lot of misconceptions about digital as a format. I think people assume, you know, in the public at large, that once something is online, it's probably safe and it probably lasts forever. In fact, the opposite is true, and we all know that platforms close and data is lost. So we designed a temporary solution to this, which is we have downloaded the videos that we've identified from their URLs with basic metadata, and we are holding those as a temporary storage solution while we pursue the donors of those works, who would have to make a formal donation into the collection for the work to be able to pass legally to the BFI. The BFI does not have statutory deposit, unfortunately, so it's very much a case of curators liaising with potential donors. And this material is a real challenge in that respect, because it's often hard to find out where it originated from. It might have ended up in your WhatsApp stream, or it might be in Twitter, but it might not have originated there. It might be work that was originally broadcast, but is now circulating online through the extra channels of those things. So it poses a load of logistical challenges for us. And I'm pleased to say that I'm not the only curator working on this project. There are several of us setting out to tackle it. And just in terms of some of the numbers, another challenge that we have is that a lot of this work defies traditional characterization or cataloging frameworks. A lot of it can be understood as having antecedents in the analog world, advertising, political messaging, what have you, but a lot of it is sort of generically of the internet, and therefore, from an archive perspective, new to us. TikTok videos, parody sketches, and various different things. And here's just a little sort of pictograph of all the different genres that we have that have come into us. And you'll see that the other category, which is the third in from the left, is not really good enough, it's not really sufficient at the moment. So we're going to drill down a little deeper to work out how to categorize that big bulk of videos that just sits in the genre of other. So we've been blogging, we've been interpreting as we go, and I'd love you all to check out Britain on Lockdown blog series on our website to see how we've sort of been chronicling this project. The blog series in and of itself is sort of an interesting tracing of lockdown. The amount of contributors to it dwindled over time as more and more staff were furloughed. So there are a couple of blogs later on with only a couple of contributors, but I'm pleased to say that we're all back now and about to enter phase 2, which is further analysis and rigor between curators as we move towards this canon of 100 web films, and then thinking about what the public facing manifestation of that project might be. So that's it in a nutshell. I hope I haven't run over too much.
Thank you so much, Will. Do pop a link into that website. It's in the chat.
I will.
That's absolutely fascinating. And I have to say, on a particularly kind of amazing compliment for some of the work we're trying to do in the web archive, because whilst we do sort of have legal deposit and can get, in inverted commas, everything, what we specifically don't get very much of is video. So it's absolutely amazing to have that picked up. I won't make you see my slides, but just to say that in the web archive, we try to capture the whole of the UK web every year, but we also try and focus on certain collections. We used to be able to rely on things like elections being, a few years apart, and that seems to have gone by the wayside. But right from the very earliest times of our existence, we were doing rapid response collecting. We did the Indian Ocean tsunami almost straight away after we were created. Collection right up to coronavirus this year, Black Lives Matter, and I'm sure that will continue. I'll pop a link in into the chat. But the main event really is kind of to talk around some of the the thoughts of collecting in 2020. We've had a couple of questions already from our audience, and one specifically, I think, for Rhoda, which was, is that document likely to be publicly accessible? Is the question from Richard.
Hi. Yeah. So we're working on our preservation and access systems for next year. So all of that will be made available. That spreadsheet in itself is quite an interesting one because it is being updated in real time. So it's about how we capture that. At the moment, we have it as a PDF, and Laemi is sending us new accruals of the spreadsheet. But it's whether or not we can kind of display it in a way that is also kind of living as a live web page.
Thanks. That's really good. Another question, which is possibly for anyone on the panel, or which I quite liked, is how do you ensure that all these stories aren't lost in a sea of other stories? I kind of thought that was quite interesting. We're all documenting things. Does anyone on the panel have a thought on that?
Can I come in on that one? Because I did respond to say that actually I don't think it's a silly question at all, and it's one that we're constantly faced with, is how do we valorize, or how do we make these really valuable stories available to the right people that have written them, the right people? And a lot of that I think is to do with creating the right catalogue systems and working with the people who give them to us to create those catalogue systems. But I'm really interested in what the BFI is doing, and the fact that you've been whittling down from 1,000 to 100 videos. And is that something that maybe we should be doing, is looking at things that are representative? I don't know. I'd like to know a little bit more about how that whittling down works, and whether that helps not lose these stories.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and we're sort of right in the middle of it. I mean, I was just typing out an answer to your question earlier, to the question earlier about that, just to say that we are documenting that process in as much as we've introduced, to the best of our ability, a pretty rigorous framework of evaluation where every video is watched by at least 3 curators, and we've got a sort of scoring system, and we've developed a collections impact statement for committee consideration. So by the end of the process, there will be a sort of breadcrumb trail of how we arrived at 100. In terms of how do we ensure that stories aren't missing, I mean, that's a sort of perennial anxiety with web film generally, I think, given the quantity of material out there at the moment, given our resources, and I imagine the resources of most institutions, representative samples are really where we're at. Trying to be completist with web film, I think, is probably a Sisyphean task. So we introduce criteria around, as I explained in the presentation earlier, around regionalism, around production type, around identifiable genre, around subject matter, around distribution platform, around diversity of perspective. And by the end, we want to have a canon that really helps us understand the implications of lockdown from all those angles and from all those perspectives. And we also want a canon of work that allows us to build a sort of timeline of the experience, if you like. So that all this matrix of decision making, which to an extent is a sort of microcosm of this sort of matrix of decision making we're using all the time when we bring new work into the national collection. We're trying to be as rigorous as possible while dealing with a very fast-paced, fast-moving environment. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, other than to say we have thought through the process and the procedure, and it's not just sort of gut reaction. We're looking at exemplars, we're looking at rare gems, we're looking at all sorts of production types. And I guess to a certain extent, the proof will be in the pudding as to whether or not you, the public, or other institutions think we've done a good job of representing that, representing the experience we've all been through web film in a diverse and sort of multifarious way.
Can I jump in on that? Just because I think I've got we're so contrasting in terms of our projects, where Will sort of has this massive institution behind him, and you've got, you know, all these different matrices that are sort of have to really be there in order to whittle down, because you do represent, and I'm sure Jason feels similarly, that you have the weight of the nation on your shoulders, and you genuinely want to try and capture everyone's sort of background. And of course, for us, it's a much smaller project where really we chose to have the editorial control ourselves at the beginning, and yet we're also really keen to collect a wide range of voices, and not just across age groups, but also globally. There were immediate technical challenges. And I can imagine also, especially with something like online video, that is specific to age groups. And so it's always hard to say we want to capture all generations, because in the end, there's only you know, X amount of people in the older generation, if you like, you know, plus 60, who actually create that type of content. And very similarly for us, we were like, okay, right, we're going to dedicate ourselves to doing a whole wide range of interviews with lots of different people, lots of different places. And oh my God, I did some interviews 3 times, because the first time the person didn't click record, because we're reliant on them recording on their own end and doing a lot of the technical setup themselves. The second time, you know, the bandwidth crashed down. You know, I was talking to someone in Uganda, you know, no internet. The third time, you know, they were on a phone that has such a poor recording quality that we can't use it. So you're sort of, I think, both with age and locations, doing this sort of archiving during the pandemic isn't just challenging because everyone's affected and you're trying to capture so many different perspectives, but also because access and knowledge of technology is also divided. It's not clear to everyone how to easily communicate via Zoom or email. You know, I mean, I spent a good hour and a half getting one of our fabulous contributors to take the voice memo she had done on her phone, upload it to email and send it to me, you know, in a sort of live 1.5 hour setting, after which we both wanted a big glass of whiskey. So, you know, there's sort of, I think the challenge isn't actually just creating the list, which you're quite happy with. It's then also executing it. And I wonder how other projects are really responding to that and getting around it to some degree, or how much you do in the end have to go out on foot eventually and just collect it in person.
Yeah, can I take that thought to another step? Someone has asked, I'll summarize it. Are you also collecting the skeptical voices on some of these subjects, so people who are skeptical about lockdown, or perhaps are not on board with Black Lives Matter, say, as just 2 issues? How do you approach those kind of issues? Do you record them? Do you omit them from these collections?
I just very briefly to say that with mass observation, we do, in fact, we probably get quite a few of them because it's an anonymous archive. So people, in a sense, maybe will reveal things about themselves or their opinions that they wouldn't necessarily say to somebody face to face or in an interview, you know, video interview or anything like that. So we do get quite a lot of the skeptics and people who may not agree with some of the sentiments in Black Lives Matter and so forth as well as many who do, I should say.
Does anyone else want to come in on that?
I was just going to speak about it from BCA's perspective, which is that I guess because BCA's got quite a specific history and has a quite specific user base, when we put out our digital call out, we didn't actually receive submissions that were kind of antagonistic to Black Lives Matter as a concept. And I think maybe that's to do with like a clarity of mission or us being quite specific in what our remit is. And I think this kind of backs onto this discussion that was previously had about how you kind of collect, you know, a range of different experiences and be like representative of a range of different experiences. And I think there's something to be said for being honest about what your remit is and what you can do. And someone also mentioned, you know, could local collections help with this? And I think that's quite important in thinking about if you're trying to collect, you know, stories around the world and there are kind of difficulties within that, maybe it's about pumping support into local initiatives who are also doing that work.
Yeah, well,
could I just respond to a couple of things? Firstly, to the point before about the gap between idea and execution. We're about to find out what the challenge of execution is as we refine our lists and then go out to donors. Everything that goes into the National Archive has to be governed by a donor agreement, which I'm sure is the same for for many of the institutions represented here today. The people who recommended videos to us for the project aren't necessarily the creators of those videos. And therefore, there's already a gap between recommenders and owners of content. And it may be that we identify a film and then we approach the creator, if we can find them, for to donate, and that they have no interest in donating at all. In which case, we're going to have a sort of rolling program of identifying a surplus of videos in order to get down to our ideal. So that's already a sort of interesting challenge. In terms of alternate perspectives, we're really interested in the rounded lockdown experience, and that includes all the debates and all the the 5G conspiracy theorists and the whole panoply basically of responses. And finally, someone asked about young people. Yes, young people is a firm category for us. We're really interested in not only in how young people are now so conversant in filmmaking and film distribution at an amateur level, but also their experiences of lockdown. So young people is a really interesting theme, and we plan to include that as well where possible.
Yeah, that's.
Jump in, Jason, on the kids as well.
Yeah.
Because we get our agreements through the parents, I think it might be a bit more straightforward to collecting the interviews. So we have actually conducted a couple of interviews with children, and I don't know how much this sort of is being done, or how the other institutions are following up with it. But what we're really hoping to do is with some of our interviews to actually return to them after several months. So I've already done follow-up interviews with 2 of our contributors, sort of 4 months after I first spoke with them. And this is what we're really interested in doing also with the kids' accounts of the time, sort of in the vein of, I don't know whether you know the TV series 7 Up, I'm sure lots do, that you actually see the development of how people are reacting over a period of time, rather than simply only pinning it down to that one moment, but how that actually evolves. And especially with the pandemic, one thing that we've become very aware of is, great increases and falls of sort of COVID fatigue, and then a surge of interest again, and then we go down, and it seems like sort of it's going to go up and down for quite a while. And so how do we actually capture those different moments of how people are reacting, because it is now a long-term issue. It's not in a way what Fiona was saying earlier, the death of Diana had massive repercussions, but it was a moment in time we could fix it. We could sort of go from there. Whereas the pandemic is really drawing out, and how do we make sure that it doesn't just become an account of March 2020, because that wouldn't really be representative of the entire time period.
Just to change the question a little bit, I've got one that I'm interested in is has collecting this year, with home working perhaps, or just the subject matter and the way we had to do it, is that going to influence how you collect in the future? How has it kind of changed as you as collectors and curators?
I certainly think for us it helps to, not that I'm trying to be opportunistic within a pandemic, but we've been making the case internally about we're in a sort of part digital, part analog process with our systems. Some of it moves very fast, some of it moves very slow, and I think if anything, this period has shown that and especially if we hope institutionally to be able to respond dynamically and front-footedly to rapid response areas of collecting, if we're going to do that, certain areas of our procedures we need to sort of transfer to a much more streamlined process. So I'm not sure if that's related to working at home particularly, but I think the nature of this project in itself, which is simultaneously fast and slow, we want it to be fast and fast. And I think we are, this project in a way helps us make that case internally.
I was going to say there's actually a reference in there to how we preserve these different formats. I think somebody in the chat has put different using different media and mediums. And it's something that we've noticed anyway over the last sort of 10 years or so, the increase in digital submissions that we get rather than handwritten submissions. And I think what is happening is, as institutions, we're all looking at digital preservation. So the amazing work that you do at the UK Web Archive, for example, but being able to sort of extend that into our institutions. If anything, I think COVID has really helped raise that as something that's vitally important for institutions to be able to preserve digital media and digital formats. It's not just me talking into the vast void of please help us with digital preservation anymore.
I suppose that is one area where the BFI can count itself lucky. We have a digital preservation infrastructure for moving image works that is great. It's that, you know, it is world class, and it you know, it commits to looking after those files and formats for as long as it can conceive of, really, or as long as we're all still here. And it migrates data, and it has a backup system, etc., etc. Where it gets a bit more challenging is things like computer games and virtual reality, but that's for a different time, I think.
Yeah, just trying to see what other questions we got. Yeah, I mean, one that kind of, I think we've touched on a little bit. This could be a terrible thing to go with 5 minutes to go, but I mean, what are some of the ethical considerations and, you know, things you have to sort of take into account, particularly with this sort of rapid response collecting around trying to get things quickly?
I mean, I think I can jump in here about the collecting. So I'm a bit the odd one out here, because I haven't talked about actual physical collecting and have instead talked about writing. And that was a bit of a conscious decision at the beginning for the V&A, especially framed around the project, the idea that we started doing rapid response collecting in 2013. And at that moment in time, our decision-making process involved kind of predetermining what the story was and collecting based on that story and whether or not that was a strong design story, a good design story, which required actually a little bit of evaluation of what the object was. And the fundamental problem of the pandemic is that it's a story that it's still evolving as we speak. And so one of the things, one of the real dangers of collecting, especially early on, collecting in March and April for us, was collecting things that in the end would have been false leads or fake promises of design that would solve problems. And by entering those into the collection, we then start to make statements that in and of themselves are slightly false. And so one of the ethical problems, I think, of thinking in terms of long-term collections is contextualizing the things that we collect so that there's not a misleading conception of their role that these things played in that time. Does that make sense?
I think that's what absolutely right, Brendan, in terms of this sense of, okay, we're collecting a moment, but is that still going to be true? Is that still going to be right? And we also know the vast amount of misinformation that sort of went along with the first few months, and still going on to some degree. In terms of the ethics, how we record, really the major thing, I guess, with doing oral history and doing interview recordings with people, actually at a time when there is a great anxiety around, everyone's feeling a great sense of anxiety, is actually you have to be conscious of talking to people and asking them about it. And I don't know to what degree some of the other projects have encountered it, but certainly for me, there were moments when you could, I have access to this stranger's story in a very personal way. And I have to judge at which point I'm putting them at danger of getting upset in the active, moment of sharing, actually, and making it worse, even though it's, I'm thinking, oh, this is great, this is a great story, this is, this is something we want to capture. I think you do have to be aware of, and I can see Rhoda and Fiona sort of nodding their heads. I think it's in these very personal accounts of history, which aren't curated, which isn't, anonymously necessarily coming to us. You do have to be aware of how people are feeling at the moment, especially being locked into their homes, as well, as fascinating as the stories will be.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. I definitely agree with what you were saying, and it made me think about kind of quite early on in the pandemic. I was in a talk about oral histories, and I can't remember who the person was, but he was saying, in terms of collecting it might be a really emotive story, and it makes sense to keep speaking about it, but what the aftercare looks like with an oral history interview like that, or with an interview like that more broadly, and it definitely jolted me into thinking about whether BCA as an organisation had the capacity to collect around COVID, for instance. And in terms of the Black Lives Matter, like collecting that we've been doing, I mean, I guess the main things we've been thinking about were how to protect protesters. So thinking about people giving over material that would in some way put protesters at risk, and asking people not to do that. And also kind of signposting people to different tools, so like metadata scrubbing, that could help with the material that they were giving over, although that also has some consequences for our processes. So it's a little bit of a balance there. And then also, because we were collecting lots of material from people who had never donated to an archive service, there was also a lot of work around just explaining that process, kind of going through the gift agreement, kind of talking through the rights issues, and trying to be as transparent about that, because I think that's something that's come up with a lot of rapid response collecting, or thinking about some examples in America where people kind of give over material and then it's used by an organization for something that they weren't quite aware of. So we're like trying to make that not happen if it's possible.
Thank you. I think incredibly sadly, we might have to start wrapping this up now. I feel we've just got started on some really fascinating discussions. Can we have another hour, please? I'm sure all of you want to thank these fantastic panelists for sharing their work with us and for continuing to do amazing work. So thank you very much. Have a brilliant day, everyone, and see you all soon.